Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, now, on Brexit donor Arron Banks, the businessman has denied claims that funding came from Russia as the National Crime Agency investigates claims of criminal offences over the funding of pro-Brexit campaign Leave.eu. The UK's election watchdog said last week it had reasonable grounds to suspect that the insurance millionaire was not the true source of £8.5 million in funding during the EU referendum in 2016. Leave.eu has already been fined £70,000 over spending irregularities, and the latest potentially lengthy investigation has prompted calls for the Brexit process to be halted. Well, to discuss what this means for the future of Brexit, let's speak to Labour MP Chuka Umunna. Hello to you, Mr Umunna. Thank you for joining us on the programme this afternoon. As far as Mr Banks is concerned, I'm sure you've seen him on the TV on various channels over the weekend saying he has no case to answer. He says the facts are wrong and that he has been slighted.
Well, he'll have the opportunity to prove this through the course of the National Crime Agency's investigation. It's worth setting in context, though, Kay, exactly what's happened here. This was the biggest political donation in UK political history. We know that the original referendum in 2016, there was just 4% in it. But we also know that the official Leave campaign, Vote Leave, but also Leave.eu, which was another Leave campaign, we already know that many of the things that they said were untrue, but we also know, because the Electoral Commission has fined both organisations, that they cheated. And if you look at the official campaign, the Vote Leave campaign, as I said, there was 4% in the vote, but they overspent by just under 8%. Now, if the Leave campaign had got a landslide, then this perhaps wouldn't matter so much, but everyone knows it was a close result. And so when people break the rules in this way, it could have a material impact on the result, which is why the results of this investigation into Mr Banks and Leave.eu are very important.
I'm told that Remain spent double what Leave did, including millions of pounds from donations from foreign banks. Is that not, as in banks as opposed to Mr Banks, is that not correct?
They, as I am aware, were both subject to the same spending limits, and the umbrella Remain campaign, Britain Stronger in Europe, kept within the spending constraints which were imposed on it by Parliament and by the Electoral Commission, but the official Vote Leave campaign and Leave.eu did not. I mean, that's a matter of fact. And in the end, you don't get to choose your facts. The facts are the facts. And obviously, the National Crime Agency is looking to see what happened in this particular instance. But of course, I mean, you ask, Kay, why this matters. Parliament is limbering up to perhaps the biggest decision we will be making as a country since the Second World War, and that is how to leave the European Union and whether it should happen or not. And so all of these things are very important for parliamentarians to bear in mind when they're making those very solemn decisions. And, you know where I'm coming from in this debate. I've always made no bones about it. I wish we weren't leaving the European Union, but ultimately I would like to see your viewers decide how we do that, which is why I want a people's vote on the final Brexit deal. I think one of the worrying things at the moment, it's clear that we're not actually going to get to vote on a deal as such. We'll just be voting on a withdrawal agreement, which wasn't what we were promised by the Prime Minister. She said that when we make these big decisions, we would know what our future arrangements, trading arrangements
that's
with the EU will
a
be.
conversation for another day, if you don't mind, Mr Umunna, because I just want to stay specifically on this, if I may. And the bottom line is, your figures are we don't know exactly how much has been spent from what we're saying this afternoon as far as Remain is concerned. But what we can say is that European banks offered a significant amount of money for the European Union for Britain to try to remain within the European Union. That's certainly what the Brexiteers are saying. On the other side, we know that £8.5 million potentially Arron Banks. We don't know where that money is coming from. He says it's come from his company. We'll have to wait and see as a part of that investigation. So,
well, hang on just a minute, Kay. The banks that are referred to, they all have UK subsidiaries and they employ tens of thousands of people in the UK, in the City of London, many of them who pay UK taxes. The issue and the reason
why... Are they European banks?
They are European banks, and we're part of the European Union, which is why they are located here. The issue with Mr Banks's donation, or the donation which he's saying came from another company, is the origin of that. So, in terms of the Remain campaign back in 20... Well, of course he does, and that's why it's been investigated by the National Crime Agency.
So while that investigation is ongoing, what should happen, I suppose, is my question.
Well, I think that, well, obviously we can't preempt what the result of that investigation should be, but I think the important thing about it is if the agency, the National Crime Agency, which is the one mainly concerned here, can actually do this investigation and produce the results before Parliament makes a final decision on these matters, then I think that would be very important, because if, you know, as I said, we've seen a load of things that called into question the original result. Parliament is going to have to determine whether it wishes to refer this back to the people. If it turns out that actually there has been further wrongdoing in this case, and that strengthens the argument for this to be referred back to the people, in my view.
Aside from any perceived influence, the mood up and down the country was one of leave, though, wasn't it?
Well, as I said, there was 4% in the result. And if you actually look at the polling at the moment, when people are asked the question as to whether they believe what the course that we're embarked on is the right one, most people are of the view that it isn't. And however people originally voted in 2016, whether it was Leave or Remain, I think it's fair to say, and we see this from polls that you've conducted here on Sky News, that nobody voted for this mess. Yeah,
but there were pockets of the South East, particularly wanted to see us remain within the European Union, up in Scotland as well, Northern Ireland. But generally around the country, most people wanted to leave. And the view is, from straw polls that we have seen, that if there was another vote, people would more firmly want to leave now than they did previously.
Well, that's not the trend of the polls. If you actually look at the headline question that people are asked in the poll of polls as to whether, if they were deciding now whether to leave the European Union or remain in it, there is a small majority for Remain. But we're talking about polls here, and ultimately I'd much rather that the people were the ones who decided what happens on the Brexit deal. I mean, when I used to come on your programme, I always enjoy coming on your programme, of course, Kay, and we were talking about this before the referendum. Essentially, you and I were having a hypothetical discussion about what would happen if the UK voted to leave the European Union. The big difference now is we actually know what is happening and what the results are, and we're not speculating as to them. We actually know what is happening. So our economy is at the bottom of the G7 growth league. It was at the top before the referendum, and there's no £350 million extra per week for the NHS. These are now things we know. OK, let me bring you back to Mr Banks today, because, you know, we can talk about Brexit every day of the week, of course. But as far as Mr Banks is concerned, this investigation is ongoing. What should happen on the 29th of March, when we are due to leave Brexit, if that investigation has not been concluded by then? Well, big question mark, and I don't necessarily accept that our departure on the 29th of March is inevitable. I mean, ultimately, Parliament's going to have to make a decision on that. So I think I don't know the answer to that question. Part of the reason I think it's really important we know the outcome of that investigation. Certainly, I would have expected, to be honest, Kay, that we will know what the outcome of the investigation will be in March, by March. And if the National Crime Agency say that there's been a huge amount of money that should have been spent here, that has been spent here that shouldn't, then I seriously question whether the whole legitimacy of the original result. And that, remember, and I say that looking in it aggregate at the facts before us, which is, you know, the main Leave campaign we know cheated, broke the rules, and we also know there were lots of untruths told. So I think, you know, when you look at the range of evidence about how this whole process started in the first instance, I really do feel that if £8 million was wrongly spent, and that's subject to investigation, it's an allegation that's been made, then it does kind of become the straw that breaks the camel's back, surely. OK. They would, of course, say something different. We did ask Mr Banks to come on today. He was unavailable. Good to talk to you, Chuck Ramuna, as always. Thank you.